I'm going to try to do a short video here on plant nutrition and Miracle-Gro. So many people say, well, I would never use Miracle-Gro. And I think that they say that because they don't understand some sort of key aspects of this subject. And I'm no genius, I'm no expert in it, but I can try to clarify some things that I think are misconceptions. When I tell people that I use Miracle-Gro and I recommend it for bioactive vivariums that are not, I don't recommend that people use misting systems or drainage layers at all. I think they're more destructive than they are beneficial. And so Miracle-Gro potting mix, or any high quality potting mix, is a really good substrate to use if you're not using those misting systems. I've used it for years. I've kept snakes on it, frogs on it, turtles, lizards, just about every herp I've kept on Miracle-Gro. I have a horned frog that burrows down in it and lives in it 24/7, and she's been there for many months now. I even have an aquarium that I've used Miracle-Gro potting mix as a substrate with a half an inch of aquarium gravel on the top of the substrate. And the little baby guppies that were born there, and everything just does fine there. So there's nothing toxic about Miracle-Gro. There's nothing toxic about the chemical fertilizer or the PERLITE or anything. So that's part of what I'm going to try to clear up. Potting mix is what they call a soilless mix. It doesn't have soil in it, what they call mineral soil, what we call dirt. There is a lot of confusion between potting mix and potting soil or topsoil. Usually products that use the word soil in the name contain mineral soil, and there's two reasons why we don't want that in our vivarium, especially topsoil, which topsoil used to be just pure dirt. Now they're mixing stuff in it and still calling it topsoil, so it's a tiny bit better, but there's no reason to use it. Even though in Europe it's a different product and they do recommend it, there's absolutely no reason to use any kind of a soil mix in your vivarium. There's a lot of good reason not to. So looking it up here on the University of Massachusetts, they've got a horticulture department extension website that explains why these soil substrates are not usable in a vivarium. One is that they're not sanitized. They're basically scraped off the ground. They're screened for large rocks, and they're bagged up. And that means all of the parasites, all of the pathogens, all of the viruses that were in the soil when they harvested it are in the bag, and you're putting that in your vivarium. That's a very bad idea. And the second thing is that these substrates that contain soil compact, which is why people who use them always add things to them. They amend them with peat and leaf litter and all that stuff. The fact is they still compact, because that's what soil does when it's not exposed to climate. So the potting mix has already amended all of those things that you do. It's already got the peat and the sphagnum and the bits of bark and stuff that you would normally amend topsoil with. So you can skip that entire step and just go ahead and use the potting mix. Oh, I wanted to say that when the soil substrates compact, they squeeze all the air pockets out. And once you squeeze the air out of a substrate, then all of the beneficial bacteria dies, the plant's roots die, and the entire substrate, really, the whole vivarium dies. So, and when these substrates dry out, with the soil substrates dry out, they don't spring back. The air doesn't move back into them like they do in potting mixes. They just stay compacted. As a matter of fact, they can become just brick hard. So when we talk about potting mixes, there's a bunch of different products out there now, and there seems to be more now than there ever have been. I just use Miracle-Gro, the straight potting mix in the big yellow bag, because it's consistently high quality. It doesn't have big chunks of crap in it. And it isn't, all of the other ones that you can get now, they're just basically putting some extra drainage in them, like some more rock or crushed up lava rock, and then they're calling it something special and charging you a bunch more for it. What I do is if I have an animal that I want extra drainage for, I just mix what they call builder's sand, which is a coarse sand. You don't want the play sand that people sometimes recommend. That's a very fine sand, and it doesn't really do much to aid in drainage. I wanted to talk just a little bit about drainage, because you'll hear people say, well, these substrates are extremely well drained, and they are. I've been looking at some of them. But the problem with that is that you really, when you heavily mist a substrate, and that substrate is very well drained, all of your nutrients are washed away and out of the root zone and into whatever basin you have that's catching the runoff from your misting system. Then that extra water is siphoned off and thrown away, and that doesn't make sense. There are some nutrients that move very easily through the substrate or through the soil, like nitrogen. And so when you heavily mist a substrate, you're washing all of the nitrogen that's desperately needed by the plants. You're washing it down the drain. It doesn't make sense to do that. What does make sense is to use a well-drained substrate, because that drainage, believe it or not, works backwards through evaporation too. If a substrate is well drained, it will evaporate back up. So it actually would be better to use those substrates without a drainage system, a drainage layer, and let that moisture and the nutrients will stay, in the substrate, and the moisture will be evaporated back up. And when the moisture is evaporated back up, then our environment becomes more humid, which for a lot of animals, that's what people are always trying to do, is get the humidity up. Well, that's the way to do it. It's not from misting it over the top. It's from letting the moisture in the substrate, just like it happens in the earth. The moisture comes out of the earth, and anything like leaves or branch or like logs or rocks or anything that are lying on the surface create humidity traps, sort of, and then you have your humidity gradient that you want in a vivarium. So now that I've convinced you all that Miracle-Gro potting mix is the best substrate for you to use in vivariums that do not have misting systems and drainage layers, I got to get that in there. But then there's a lot of concern about PERLITE, and there's also concern about the toxic chemical fertilizers. I hear that a lot. So the PERLITE is a rock. It's a type of rock, and it's actually a type of obsidian, I just learned, which is it's a volcanic rock. It's almost like glass. When it is heated up to like 2,000 degrees or something, it pops like popcorn. And that PERLITE is simply that rock that's been popped. It's completely inert. It doesn't dissolve. It doesn't interact with chemicals. It's not poisonous. It is. I wanted to mention this. I saw one of these guys that are selling substrate, some expensive substrate, that said, proudly saying that their substrate did not contain potentially radioactive PERLITE. That's just amazing that anybody would kind of stoop that low to try to promote their product. There's no radioactivity that's of any threat to anyone coming from PERLITE. They use PERLITE to make women's skincare products, for God's sakes, that they rub on their face. So for people to claim that, basically, in my opinion, they lose all credibility when they make those kind of outrageous claims. So PERLITE, we're done with it. I don't want anyone to feel like there's anything that risky about a product with PERLITE in it. It's put in there for drainage, just like the coarse sand. And if an animal happens to ingest it accidentally, which, by the way, they never do, but if they were to ingest it accidentally, it would just pass, like any small stone would. Next, I wanted to talk about the dangerous chemical fertilizers that are in some of these potting mixes. And in order to do that, what I think part of the problem is that people think that anything that's organic is safe, and anything that's not organic or chemical is not safe. And that's just not true at all. I mean, there's a lot of organic substances that are just deadly. The plants in our vivariums there's like a subset of chemicals that they need. And that's all they need, are chemicals, elements, they're called. And they can use these nutrients, sometimes called nutrients, sometimes called salts. They're divided into different groups. There's like macronutrients, the three main nutrients that they need, which is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And those numbers, the percentage of nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, should be listed on every product that you buy. I mean, substrate or fertilizer. If it doesn't list it, you shouldn't buy it. And a lot of these places that sell these products, like these amendments and these miraculous BioVive and stuff like that, they won't tell you what's in them. And that's extremely dangerous, because if you don't know what your substrate needs, you can be doing more harm than good by putting in these supplements. An example I'll give you, I had a bioactive vivarium that had a very messy animal in it for 18 months. And at the end of that, I thought, well, I want to see what this animal did to this. It was Miracle-Gro, actually. And so I took it to a soil lab and I had it analyzed. And it was good soil. After 18 months, I never really did anything to it. It didn't have a drainage layer. But the nutrients, what they sometimes call salts, were quite high. I mean, in some cases, they were really at the point where, like the calcium was really at the point where if you had salt-sensitive plants, they would be suffering. I only had pothos, which you can't kill with a hammer, and that was fine. But so if I did start seeing stress in these plants, right, and I didn't know what was up with my substrate, I could very easily call one of these guys, say, hey, my plants are yellowing or whatever, or browning, and they may say, oh, you need BioVive, you need this amendment. Well, if I would have brought that home and put it in my vivarium, it probably would have killed the plants that were suffering. And as it turns out, that all of these nutrients were coming from the tap water I was using. Since this was for a snake and not a frog, I used tap water when I needed to. And the salts that are just naturally occurring in the tap water had driven up the concentrations to the point where they would have become a problem if I hadn't switched the animal to a bigger enclosure. So it doesn't matter if the calcium, in this case, or any of these other nutrients came from organic sources or inorganic sources. Both would have killed my plants. And the thing is that the chemical fertilizers are, when you put them, when they're available and you water your substrate, they're immediately available to the plant. The plant can take them up immediately. The organic fertilizers, they usually come from bat guano or chicken waste, like from where they butcher the chickens, or from fish meal. Those organic substances have to be broken down by bacteria and release then the elemental forms of the nutrients that the plants can take up. So, in other words, they have to break these things down until they get to their elemental form, which is the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, the calcium. All of the same chemicals that are in a chemical fertilizer, they're identical. If they weren't identical, the plants wouldn't be able to use them. So you can say, well, I only use organic fertilizer. To the plant, it doesn't matter at all. You can't use it until it becomes basically a chemical fertilizer by the action of the bacteria. So the point I want to make about Miracle-Gro is that it has what they call a starter dose of fertilizer in it, which is a minuscule amount. For instance, I think the nitrogen is 0.2%, right? And the phosphorus is like 0.1%, and the potassium is about the same. If you buy, I actually talked to the bio dude, whatever his name is, and I asked him straight up, I said, why don't you put your fertilizer analysis on your products, because there's a whole bunch of marketing BS, but basically it's a fertilizer that they're selling. That's BioVive, a miraculous soil, blah, blah, blah. What is it? Well, it's a fertilizer. It's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and maybe some micronutrients. So I said, why don't you put that on there? Why don't you put the ingredients? Why don't you put the concentration, right? And he said, well, it's 444. I'm like, okay, fine. That means it's 4% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 4% potassium. Miracle-Gro is, like I said, 0.2% nitrogen, a tiny fraction of the same chemical fertilizer eventually that's in these, wonderful organic fertilizers that you buy in the online stores for 100 times what you would have to pay for it.